The wind moved through the dead valley, carrying dust and whispers from long ago. The sky above was orange and dry, and the sun never smiled on the land. Any more deep in the center of this valley was a crater not made by war or falling stars, but by something older and stranger. The ground around it was cracked and dark, and nothing ever grew there, not even weeds. The center of the crater stood the sword, tall and shining. Even though no light touched it, the blade floated just above the aid. Broken stone, its edges glowing with a soft white fire, ancient carvings. Moved slowly along its surface, changing as if alive. No one had ever lifted it, no one had ever touched it, and lived aliens. From across the stars came to try, they came with pride. And songs and strong armor, they came with big names and louder promises. Some were kings, some were warlords, some were monsters and giant bodies, but all left the crater in pain or silence. The sword would not move for them, it would not sing, it would not shine. They built a city around the crater made from silver stone and black glass. They called it the place of testing. In each year, they sent their best warriors into the crater to prove their strength. Every year the sword burned their hands, or threw them back, or showed them visions of failure. They called it the blade that chose no one in. This day the wind carried something different. A human walked through the dry land wearing nothing but dusty clothes and a broken backpack. His name was Jacob, and he did not look like a hero. His eyes were tired, his boots were torn, and his body moved like it remembered too much pain. He had no map, no plan, he was just trying to survive. The guards saw him near the crater and laughed. They thought he was lost or mad. One pointed and said, "Let him go and the sword will finish him faster than we can." But others were curious. They let him pass just to see what would happen. No human had ever reached the blade before. No human had dared. Jacob walked into the crater, slow and careful. Each step made the ground whisper louder, and the sword began to hum. Its glow turned soft like moonlight, and the carvings on its surface began to swirl faster. The watchers on the edge of the crater stopped talking. They stared in silence as Jacob walked closer. He paused only once, about 5 steps from the blade. He tilted his head and frowned like he heard something, but no one else heard it. The wind stopped. The dust fell still. Even the air held its breath. Jacob reached out, not fast, not bold, just like someone checking if something was real. The sword moved, did not fly or swing or flash. Instead, it tilted slightly and turned toward him like it had been waiting, like it had been watching for years. And now it had found what it wanted. A cry came from one of the nobles above. "This is not right," he shouted. "Humans have no claim," but the sword answered it, pulsed with light, and a wave of sound pushed the noble back to the ground. His guards ran to help him, but none dared enter the crater. Jacob stood with his hand near the blade, his fingers shaking, but not from fear. He whispered something too low to hear, and then his hand touched the hilt. No fire came, no pain, no visions of doom. The sword shined brighter than ever before. The carvings stopped moving and locked into place, forming symbols of stars and flames. The sword rose into the air as if greeting him, and Jacob just stared like he was trying to understand a dream. The crowd did not cheer, they did not shout. They just watched with wide eyes and frozen breath. They had waited lifetimes for this. They had built temples and written songs, but the blade had chosen a human. A lost, tired, dirty human who did not even know the stories. Jacob lowered his hand and the sword stayed by his side, floating like a loyal ghost. He turned to the crowd but said nothing. His eyes showed confusion but also calm, like something inside him had already known. The wind returned and the ground began to hum under his feet. Something deep and powerful had woken up across the stars. A signal was sent, and far away something old and hungry opened its eyes. But in the crater where the sword now waited beside the human, all was still, and the watchers knew the old age had ended and a new one had begun. Asterisk. The guards kept their distance from the human. None dared step into the crater where the sword now floated beside him. Jacob stood in silence with his hand just inches from the glowing blade. His face looked calm, but his heart beat like a drum inside his chest. He could not explain what had just happened. He had never heard of this sword or the crater or the alien city around him yet. When he touched the hilt, something deep in his bones said yes. The wind around him whispered words he could not understand, Voices soft and old, speaking through air and light, the sword pulsed again as if breathing with him. Its light no longer bright, but steady and warm, the carvings on its surface glowed. With a faint red and gold pattern, forming shapes that felt familiar, though he had never seen them before. Above the crater, the alien leaders argued in sharp voices. Some shouted that it was a trick, others called for Jakob's arrest. One older alien, in long silver robes, stepped forward and raised his arm. The crowd grew quiet at once. His name was High Speaker Varun, and his word carried power. Varun pointed at Jakob, and his voice echoed across the stone walls. He said, "The sword is bound to ancient law, and this human has broken the law by standing where he should not." Jakob did not speak. He only looked up and waited. The sword floated closer to his side and stayed there like it belonged. Varun turned to the guards and gave the order. "Take him now, but be gentle. The sword may strike again." For armored aliens moved down the crater slope, each step slow and careful. Their weapons stayed on their backs. None wished to face the blade that had rejected their best warriors. They circled Jakob with a net made of bright light and closed it around him. The sword did not attack, but its light dimmed to a deep red, as if watching. Jakob raised no hand to stop them. He did not fight. He let them pull him from the crater and lead him through the wide path toward the city gates. Crowds followed in silence, some curious, some afraid. None had ever seen the sword move, none had seen it glow, none had seen it rest beside anyone before. In the prison under the city, the air smelled of oil and stone. The walls hummed with quiet energy. The guards placed Jakob in a clear cell with no doors, only shifting lights. The sword floated outside the barrier, not trying to cross, not trying to leave, just staying close, like a guard or a ghost. Jakob sat on the cold bench and rested his arms on his knees. The voice from earlier still whispered inside his mind, but now it was softer. He closed his eyes and let the words wash over him. "You are late," the voice said again. "Too much time has passed and too many lies have taken root." He opened his eyes and found a figure watching him from the shadows on the other side of the cell. A girl no older than 17. Her skin had a soft green tone, and her eyes were deep silver. Her clothes were simple, but her stance strong. She stepped forward and spoke with a quiet voice. "My name is Lyra, and I came because I saw you in the stars." Jakob tilted his head and said nothing. Lyra walked up to the edge of the light barrier and placed her hand near the surface. Her fingers did not cross it, but the light moved toward her like it knew her. "The sword chose you," she said softly. "I was told in stories that one day a stranger would touch it, and when it glowed, the old path would return." Jacobi looked at her with tired eyes. "I never asked for this," he whispered. Lyra nodded. "I believe you, but this world did, and the sword did, and now everything will change." A sudden tremor shook the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the lights flickered. Red alarms began to ring through the prison halls, and voices shouted in alien tongues outside. Jakob stood and looked at the sword, which now spun slowly with sharp blue light dancing along its blade. Lyra's voice trembled. "Something is waking up." Jakob reached out toward the glowing barrier, and to his surprise, the lights parted for him. The shield dropped like mist. The sword flew to his side, and the whispers in his mind grew louder. "Your time is short," said the voice. "Your trial begins now." Jakob stepped out of the cell, and Lyra followed behind him. Guards ran toward them, but the sword flashed once, and the path opened. Jakob did not understand what he was walking toward or what waited in the deep places below the city, but his steps did not shake, and the sword glowed brighter with every breath he took, as if guiding him toward something only it could see. The hallway outside the prison cell stretched like a tunnel of glass and light, with no guards left to stop them, only empty boots and dropped weapons. Kope walked forward slowly, his boots echoing against the smooth floor. The sword floated beside him, its glow soft but sharp like a thought waiting to become a storm. Lyra stayed close behind, watching him not with fear, but with something like hope or warning. City above them was made of high towers and long bridges, all shaped like blades. Pointing to the sky, windows blinked with strange blue light, and floating orbs moved between platforms, carrying news or secrets, or both. Loudspeakers across the walls spoke in fast alien words, but Jakob could not understand them. Still he felt the tension in the air, as if something large and old had stirred from sleep. Lyra pulled him into a narrow passage hidden between two walls. Her fingers tapped a panel, and a door slid open, revealing a dark chamber filled with glowing roots and hanging lights. The air here was cooler, quieter, filled with the hum of something breathing from deep below. This place is older than the city, she said. It was built by the ancients, not by the empires you see now. They buried it when they began to fear. What? It held. Jacob looked around at the carvings on the walls. They showed shapes like humans and stars and great beasts falling from the sky. Each figure held a sword that looked like the one floating beside him. The carvings told a story without words. A story of war, of light and shadow, of something lost and something hidden. Lyra lit a small orb that showed a map across the floor. It was not just the city, but the whole planet. Lines ran from the crater to dozens of deep points underground. One of them pulsed red. That is where the swarm was last sealed, she whispered. And the sword chose you, because the seal is breaking again. Jacob turned to her and asked, "How do you know this?" She touched the wall, and a panel opened, revealing a small cube of light. "My mother was one of the last watchers before she vanished. She told me to find the one the sword accepts and guide him before it is too late." Jacob closed his eyes and breathed slow. The voice in his head still spoke, but now it felt closer, clearer, like it was inside his own thoughts. "You must reach the gate," the voice said. "It lies in the mountain beneath the blood stone sky." Suddenly the floor shook again, and red lights flashed across the ceiling. The hum turned into a roar, and the chamber lights died for a breath of silence. Then came a sound like thunder mixed with metal. The city was under attack. "They are here!" Lyra gasped. The swarm broke through the void. Jacob turned to the sword, which now glowed with pure white fire, its edge sharp and cold like winter light. He stepped toward the wall, and the carvings began to move, reacting to the blade. They parted to form a new tunnel behind them. He turned back to Lyra and nodded. She followed without question as they moved through the dark path. The sword lit the way. The walls around them whispered in different voices, some old, some young, all speaking of trials to come and shadows that remembered. They reached a wide chamber with a circular floor and a large ring at its center, made of black stone. Veins of gold pulsed through it like a heart trying to beat again. Above it floated a hollow sphere spinning with starlight. "Is the trial gate?" Lyra whispered. "The sword must show your spirit to the core. If you pass, it will open. If you fail, it will burn you from within." Jacob looked at the sword, which now floated ahead of him. As if waiting for permission, he nodded and stepped into the ring. Light surrounded him. Heat crawled up his spine, and the voice in his head turned into 1,000 voices, all asking the same question. "Why do you carry you as visions?" Slammed into him voices of fear, memories of fire, a child crying in a metal hallway, soldiers falling around him, a last breath held in the dark. Jacob dropped to one knee, but the sword held him up, floating just before his face. He did not lie, he did not fight, he only whispered the truth because no one else would, and the chamber heard. Him light exploded from the ring, the floor cracked, the air turned white and silent. Then the light faded and Jacob stood alone, still breathing. The sword now rested in his hand, not beside him, no longer floating. It had accepted his grip. The wall behind the ring opened with a deep sound, and warm wind poured through from a tunnel glowing with ancient gold light. Lyra stepped beside him and whispered, "You passed." Jacob did not smile. He only said, "Then let us finish what we started," and stepped into the tunnel as the sword hummed with new power, and the path ahead began to shake under the weight of what was coming. Asterisk. The tunnel opened into a wide arena carved deep into the earth, with walls made of black stone and silver. Bone light poured from high windows cut into the rock, letting in beams that shimmered across the sand below. The stands were filled with aliens of many kinds, warriors, leaders, nobles, and shadows in cloaks. All came to see the trial of the one who held the blade. Jacob stepped into the center of the arena with the sword now fully in his hand. Its glow pulsed with steady light, like a heart that refused to slow. The air was hot and dry and carried the smell of dust and fear across the walls. Ancient carvings flickered with red fire, showing old battles and broken heroes. This was a place where the sword once tested champions before the fall of the First Empire. Lyra stood behind the gate, watching him with wide eyes. Her voice lost in the noise of the crowd, she wanted to reach him, to warn him, to remind him he was not like the others, but her voice would not cross the flame wall that now rose between Thema. Voice echoed across the arena, not from a mouth but from the stone itself. This is the trial of spirit and flame, no armor, no shield, only the sword and the soul behind it. The first challenger entered through a gate on the left, a massive creature covered in metal plates with 6 arms and a face. Like a cracked skull, it roared and slammed the ground, sending sand into the air. The crowd screamed in joy and hunger. This beast had ended 50 champions in the last moon. Jakob did not run. He did not raise the sword high. He only lowered his stance and waited. The sword pulsed once and then twice, and Jakob moved with a speed he did not understand. The blade met the creature's arm and slid through it like water through silk. The beast cried out and swung with another limb. Jacobi ducked and turned, and the blade cut again and again, but not to kill. Each strike disabled. Each cut slowed the beast until it fell to one knee and lowered its head in silence. The crowd did not cheer. They stared with confused eyes. The gate opened again, and 3 more warriors stepped out, one with wings, one with fire in its chest, and one that moved like smoke. They attacked at once, fast and deadly, with weapons of bone and light. Jacob spun, with the blade leading him. The sword burned with white and blue, and his feet moved as if carried by the earth itself. He dodged, he blocked, he moved through them, not like a fighter but like a wind that bends before the storm and then ends it with a whisper. The fire fell first, then the wings, then the smoke, each one falling without death, without hate, without fear. The crowd was no longer cheering. They were silent, watching the human who fought with grace, not rage, and the sword that seemed to dance for him alone. The final gate opened, and from it walked a tall woman with silver skin and no eyes. Her steps were slow, and the ground froze under her touch. She held no weapon, but her presence brought cold into the hearts of all who watched. She was the Warden of Flame, the last guardian of the sword, before it vanished. Jacob looked into her empty face, and the sword in his hand dimmed for the first time. She spoke with a voice that cracked stone. "You do not belong here yet." The blade listens. "Tell me why I should not end you." Now Jacob did not lift the sword. He lowered it and spoke. "I do not fight for glory. I do not fight for thrones. I fight because I was the only one left standing when no one else did." The warden moved like wind, and Jacob barely raised the blade in time. Her hands struck like fire and cold together, each blow testing, each strike judging. The sword glowed brighter with every touch until it burned with gold and red and white. Jacob cried out as her hand struck his chest, and he fell to the sand, blood rising in his mouth. The sword hovered above him, shaking with power. The warden raised her arm for the final blow, but the sword moved before she could. Its light became a wall between them, and it spoke in sound and wind and light, not words but feeling enough. The warden stopped, her hand frozen in the air. She stepped back and lowered her arms. She looked at Jacob and nodded. "Once the sword has chosen, the trial is complete." The flame wall vanished. The crowd remained silent. Lyra ran across the sand to reach Jacob. As he struggled to rise, the sword floated beside him again, its glow now softer, warmer, like it had found what it waited for across 1,000 years from above the arena. A deep voice rang through the stone halls. "The gate has been passed. The path to the heart is open. Let the bearer walk the world once more." Jacob stood, blood on his face, dust in his hair, sword in his hand, and behind him the gate to the forgotten chamber cracked open as wind full of voices poured through into the light of the living world. The gate behind the arena groaned as it opened wide, revealing a dark tunnel lined with stone that glowed faintly with old power. The carvings on the walls shimmered with soft blue light, and strange symbols moved across them like streams flowing uphill. Jacob stood at the edge of the gate with the sword in his hand and pain still burning through his side. The crowd behind him whispered in shock and awe, but he no longer heard them. His eyes were fixed on the path ahead. Lyra came to his side, her breath short and her hands shaking, but her eyes were steady. She reached for his arm and helped him stay on his feet together. They stepped into the tunnel, and the stone door slid shut behind them, cutting off the noise and light of the outside world. Only the gentle glow of the walls remained, and the soft hum of something deep below. They walked, the sword pulsed with warmth, guiding them left and right through halls that twisted like roots. The path curved downward with every step taking them deeper into the earth, deeper than any map showed, deeper than any living memory. The walls changed from stone to crystal, from crystal to smooth metal. Then to something that felt alive under their fingers. Jacob asked, "Where are we going?" And Lyra answered, "I think we are going to the beginning." They entered a wide chamber shaped like a dome with a high ceiling covered in mirrors that reflected stars. Even though they were underground, in the center of the room floated a great stone slab carved with images of humans and aliens standing together around a blazing sword, just like the one in Jacob's hand, but older, colder, buried in shadow. "This is where the first blades were made," Lyra whispered. "This is where your kind stood before they vanished. This is the truth they buried. This is the fear they tried to forget." Jacob moved closer to the floating stone, and the sword in his hand began to hum with a low sound. The symbols on the slab shifted to show a galaxy spinning around a black core. And from that core came darkness, shaped like a wave, crawling across planets, devouring stars, consuming light. The sword was not made to rule. It was made to stop this. Lyra stepped forward and touched the slab. Her fingers triggered a pulse of light that raced through the chamber and unlocked a second chamber below the floor. It opened like a mouth and a staircase folded down into glowing blue mist. Jacob followed her down each step, burning with old memory. At the bottom they found a chamber with walls of glass showing visions of distant systems and broken worlds. Each image held a marker, and each marker glowed red except for one. It glowed white, and it pulsed in rhythm with the sword. "That one is still clean," Jacob said, "or maybe still untouched." Lyra replied, "No, that one is waking up." They stood in silence as the sword floated to the center of the room and projected a new image. A sphere made of layers of light and metal surrounded by rings of fire and cold. The voice in Jacob's mind returned, softer now, but more clear. The swarm was sealed, not killed. It fed on the sleep of time. Now it stirs, and soon it will rise. This blade is not enough alone. It must remember the others. It must awaken the flame towers and the watchers. It must bring the bond back to life. Jacob dropped to one knee as the images filled his head. More blades, more wielders, more voices, all waiting, hidden, locked behind trials and pain and blood and choices. Sword flared and shot a beam into the ceiling, which opened to reveal a hidden lift made of gold and air. They stepped on it, and it began to rise, taking them back toward the city. But not the arena. Instead it rose into the Tower of Truth, the oldest spire of the city that only priests could enter before. No, the lift stopped before a chamber of silence, and Jacob stepped through the doors, the sword still in hand, its glow now steady, like a sun waiting to rise. Inside stood statues of alien warriors and human guardians, some broken, some whole, each holding a different weapon, each watching Jacob with stone eyes. A voice echoed through the chamber, not from the sword but from the walls themselves. "You are not the first, you are not the last. You are the waking hand, the fire between ends." Jacob felt no fear, only weight, the kind that settles in your bones when you know there is no turning back. Lyra looked at him with something more than faith, maybe love, maybe sorrow, maybe both alike. Above them blinked 3 times, and then a signal went out across the galaxy, silent and strong. It passed through stars and ships and sleeping things, and one by one, in corners of dust and shadow, ancient eyes began to open. An old machine started to stir again. Jacob turned to the window and looked out at the world below, knowing that the sword had not just chosen him, it had chosen a war he had not yet seen, and a price he did not yet know, but he would pay it, because no one else would. Asterisk. The tower shook as thunder rolled through the sky, though. There were no clouds above, only a field of stars blinking cold and far. Jacob stood at the highest window, looking down at the city with the sword glowing at his side. The people below moved like ants. Lights flickered in fear and signals raced through the towers, but none of it mattered to him now. The storm was not above. It was already here. Stood behind him, watching with quiet breath. She had seen the old signs in the sky, red stars falling backward and moons that pulsed like hearts. She knew the swarm had come through the void again, Only this time there were no legends left to stop it, only a tired man and a blade that remembered. A sharp tone rang through the chamber, and the center wall opened, revealing a council of alien leaders, all watching Jakob through crystal panels. Their faces showed doubt and panic and pride, all mixed into one. They asked him questions with fast words and louder voices, demanding answers for what he had done, demanding to know who gave him the right to hold the sword. Jakob said nothing at first, only turned and let the sword float in front of him, its glow changing from white to deep blue and then to a sharp silver. The room grew cold as the blade pulsed once and the lights above flickered. The council members fell silent as if a hand had pressed against their mouths. He spoke then, with no rage and no shouting, only truth. I did not come here to lead, but the sword chose me. I did not ask for war, but it has found me, and now you must choose. Follow or fall. One of the elders laughed and called him mad, but the sword flashed and the elder's panel went dark, his voice replaced by static, and the silence that followed held more weight than his words. Ever could Lyra stepped forward and showed the map from below, the one that showed the swarm's movement in the last clean system. The council saw the truth, then not in her voice, but in the light that moved across the stars. Their walls could not stop what was coming. Their fleets were broken, their armies unready. Only the blade had seen this before. Only the human held its memory. Jakob left the tower without waiting for their answer. The sword guided his steps down into the heart of the city where the people had gathered in fear. In confusion, children cried in the arms of creatures twice their size. Merchants closed their stalls with shaking hands. Soldiers held their weapons without knowing why they were trembling. He walked into the center square and raised the sword high, and the light from it rose higher still, shooting into the sky. Like a pillar of fire, the clouds above cracked open, and the shield around the city formed once more. Ancient systems, waking from their long sleep, powered by the bond between blade and bearer. The people watched as the sky turned gold and the air grew still. The ground beneath them stopped shaking, and for a moment they felt safe again. Not because of walls or weapons, but because someone stood between them, and the dark ships screamed. Through the sky above, black with red marks and alive. With swarm breath, they fell like burning ice and broke against the shield that now covered the city, each one crashing in silence before it could reach the ground. Jakob stood with the sword humming in his hand, and the swarm screamed through the wind, not with sound, but with pressure and pain that crawled into minds and squeezed until they begged for it to stop. But the sword pushed it back, and the pain vanished as quickly as it came. Lyra came to his side, holding a signal device. She had tuned it to the old codes, the ones used by the lost fleets, the ones buried by the first empires. She handed it to him, and he spoke through it, calling across space to the broken ships and hidden bases. To the Watchers still alive and the Guardians in exile, he told them the blade had returned and the war had begun against them. Message flew through the stars and woke sleeping captains in silent systems. Some answered with light, some with fire, some with fire, some with nothing at all. But the signal moved onward, reaching deeper. Each time, Jakob turned to Lyra, asked if she was ready. She said no, but stepped forward anyway, and they walked through the gate together as the shield pulsed and opened for a breath. Long enough to let them pass outside the city. The world had changed. The sky boiled with swarm fire, and the wind carried voices that had never spoken aloud. Jakob walked toward the nearest hill and raised the sword, and from behind him came warriors. Not just from the city, but from old ruins and fallen outposts, led not by fear, but by a light they had forgotten. The sword called the storm, but it also lit the path, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the galaxy had hope again, and the name of that hope was not a king or a god or a myth. It was Jakob and the sword he carried, and the choice he had made when no one else would. The sky above the valley was not the same as before it burned. Now with colors that had no names, with flames that moved like rivers, and clouds that twisted into shapes of memory and fear. Jakob stood at the front of the rise with the sword glowing. Like a second sun beside him, the swarm moved across the land like a flood of ash, and teeth covering the plains and crawling over broken ships and dead. He's behind. Jacob stood thousands of alien warriors holding weapons from every corner of the stars, their armor cracked and their eyes heavy. But they did not retreat because they had seen the sword and they had heard its call in something. Deep in them remembered the old fire that once made stars flee. The ground shook as the swarm came closer, and the air filled with the sound of claws tearing through metal and wings made of bones slicing the wind. The first wave struck like a storm, and the shield wall bent under the pressure, but Jacob stepped forward and raised the blade, and light burst from it like lightning shaped into a scream. The swarm paused not from fear but from recognition. They had felt that light before long ago when it had nearly ended them, when it had sealed them behind the void and taken their queen from them. Jacob moved through them like fire without heat. The blade did not touch many yet. The swarm fell as if burned by truth alone around him. The warriors formed ranks not with orders but with instinct, each step guided by the rhythm of his sword. Each breath echoing his will. Lyra fought beside him with a blade made of blue stone and a heart full of purpose. She had once dreamed of peace now. She stood in the center of war and felt no regret, only the weight of everything she had chosen. Swarms sent their champions, beasts taller than towers with eyes made of spinning dark matter, each one a monster shaped by fear and fed by time. Jacob faced them without rage, only calm. With each strike the sword remembered its old language and spoke. Through fire and motion and soundless thunder, one by one, the great monsters fell, not in silence but in a cry that reached into the stars. The sky cracked again, and from the rift came something larger than all before, a queen of the swarm wrapped in armor grown from pain and wings made of ancient screams. Her voice filled the world and called Jacob by name, not the one he knew, but the one the sword had given him. You are the hand of the flame, she said, and I was once its heart. Jacob stepped forward, and the light from his blade met her shadow in the sky. A storm formed between them, wind turned into weapons and gravity itself bent around their clash. The world held its breath as fire met silence, and two truths became one. He saw her memories, not with eyes but with feeling. Once she had been human, once she had touched the same sword, once she had failed and chosen hunger over hope. She begged him to end it, to finish what she could not. But Jacob lowered the blade not in mercy but in choice. He reached with his free hand and took hers, and the sword flared so bright that every warrior turned away, not in fear but in awe. The queen screamed once, and her voice became wind, then silence, then dust. The swarm stopped as if the core of their being had vanished. The storm broke, the sky cleared, and the light from the sword dimmed to a soft gold. Jacob fell to his knees, not in pain but in peace. The sword rested beside him, not floating, not glowing, just still like a sleeping sun. Warriors came to him not with cheers but with hands outstretched in silence and respectfully, and knelt beside him and whispered, "You did not destroy them, you freed them." He looked at her and smiled, not with pride but with something deeper, something like home. The galaxy changed in that moment, not with a shout but with a breath, with a choice, with a human who held a blade made for kings and gods and chose instead to carry it like a promise. They buried the sword in the place where the battle ended, not in honor but in truth, because it had done its part, and now the galaxy must learn to walk without it again. Jacob vanished in the years that followed. Some say he became light, others say he became legend, but Lyra always said he became what the sword had always waited for, not a hero, not a killer, but a final wielder who chose not to rule, but to end the war and walk away from the fire forever.